In modern relationships, we often glorify the idea of pursuit. It has become a cultural motif, the relentless pursuit of love, the grand gestures, the sacrifices made in the name of winning someone's heart. But underneath this romanticized image lies a dangerous distortion. The idea that love must be proven through chasing, even when that chase requires us to abandon ourselves in the process. The truth is, real men, whole men don't chase, they connect. And when connection is not reciprocal, they walk away not because they are indifferent, but because they are deeply rooted in self-respect. In intimate dynamics, many people confuse persistence with affection. They believe that if someone is worth loving, they must keep proving their devotion, even when their efforts are not met, even when their needs go unnoticed. This belief creates a harmful imbalance, where one person is always reaching while the other remains distant. Pursuit becomes a performance rather than a dialogue, and real intimacy cannot survive in performance. It thrives in resonance, in a space where both people are equally engaged and emotionally present. When a man does not chase, it is not because he lacks passion. It's because he understands the cost of giving his energy to a space that does not nourish him. He is not cold, but discerning. He has learned, often through pain and experience, that love extracted through pressure loses its depth. That affection given out of obligation quickly turns into resentment. His refusal to chase is not a lack of care. It is an embodiment of care for himself. It is his way of saying, I will not make myself smaller to be noticed. I will not distort my essence to be chosen. The man who walks away silently is not absent of emotion. Quite the opposite. He is attuned deeply to his own emotional landscape. He has likely tried before. He has given, he has shown up, he has offered his truth. But he knows that chasing someone who is not emotionally available is not a testament of love. It is an abandonment of the self. And he refuses to participate in that anymore. His boundary is not a wall. It is a mirror, reflecting the truth of the relationship back to the other person. He doesn't blame, he doesn't beg. He allows the lack of reciprocity to speak for itself. The pursuit model we're often conditioned to follow is rooted in insecurity, in the belief that we must do something to be enough, that we must impress, fix, or rescue to be lovable. But true connection isn't about proving, it's about meeting. A man who values himself doesn't seek to convince. He does not enter a dynamic trying to earn someone's presence. He is open, yes, and willing to grow, but not at the cost of self-erasure. His strength lies not in persistence, but in presence. And when that presence is met with indifference, he does not argue. He exits. When he walks away, there is no need for loud declarations. He doesn't turn the moment into a spectacle. He knows that clarity doesn't always need explanation. His silence is not avoidance. It is wisdom. It is a choice to disengage from emotional games. It is an act of trust in the organic unfolding of life. He understands that what is aligned will remain, and what is not meant for him will fall away. He does not control the outcome. He aligns with his values. This form of self-respect is often misunderstood. It can be labeled as cold, detached, or too proud. But there's a profound difference between pride and dignity. Pride needs to be right. Dignity just needs to be whole. A man who does not chase is not punishing the other person. He's protecting his energy. He's saying, I want mutual desire, not a transaction. I want to be seen as I am, not as I perform to be. This kind of emotional intelligence is not loud. It doesn't need validation. It rests quietly in the certainty of self. It is also important to recognize that this behavior is not about playing hard to get or following manipulative strategies. It is not a calculated silence to provoke a response. It is a mature decision made from a place of integrity. The absence of chasing is not a game, it's a boundary. It is a response to emotional inconsistency, to the misalignment between words and actions. When affection is withheld, when emotional availability is absent, he doesn't try harder. He steps back. The man who doesn't chase teaches a different model of connection, one based on self-honoring, emotional responsibility, and authenticity. He does not believe love should be a battlefield where the loudest, most persistent wins. He believes it should be a garden nurtured from both sides. And when only one pair of hands is tending to the soil, he knows that garden will never bloom. He does not curse the soil. He simply puts down the watering can and walks away with grace. To walk away without creating destruction, without leaving emotional wreckage behind, without bitterness, without trying to control the perception of others. This is not weakness. It is not a void of feeling or a sign of detachment. It is emotional maturity. It is the wisdom that comes from knowing when to engage and when to release, when to fight for connection, and when to recognize that your presence alone is no longer enough to hold something. Together, walking away silently and gracefully is not about indifference. It is a deeply intentional act rooted in self-respect and emotional awareness. In our relational lives, many of us are taught to hold on, to try harder, to compromise more, to sacrifice even when the sacrifice begins to wound us. We are rarely taught how to leave when staying would mean betraying ourselves, how to exit with dignity without punishing, without guilt, tripping and without dramatizing the departure. But the mature man knows this. He knows that there comes a point when staying becomes an act of self-abandonment, and leaving becomes a way of returning to himself. This kind of walking away is not reactive. It's not done in anger. It's not driven by ego. There is no need for final speeches, no rehearsed monologues, no last-minute pleadings. There is instead a stillness, a kind of sacred quiet in his withdrawal. He has already examined the relationship within himself. He has asked the hard questions. He has stayed long enough to understand the patterns. He has noticed when his emotional presence is taken for granted. And he has realized that chasing after what no longer moves toward him does not deepen love. It dilutes it. Emotional maturity means knowing that love is not a project. You cannot fix another's inability to meet you emotionally. You cannot compensate endlessly for their lack of presence, availability, or reciprocity. You cannot make someone ready by loving them harder. There is a limit to what effort alone can accomplish in relationships. The man who walks away silently has reached that limit. Not because he's given up on love, but because he refuses to let love become something that empties him rather than fills him. He does not walk away to create distance for the sake of power. He does not disappear to create confusion. He is not performing a tactic. He is choosing a truth, and that truth is this: connection requires both people to show up, not just with words, but with actions, emotional consistency, and presence. When that is no longer mutual, he stops clinging to the illusion. He stops trying to rewrite the story. He acknowledges that it has changed, that the space once filled with intimacy has become occupied by silence, excuses, or apathy. There's a quiet nobility in walking away without drama, without needing to justify every feeling, without attempting to rewrite someone else's behavior. He doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't chase closure that will never come in the form he wishes. Instead, he creates his own closure through action, through stepping back, through not insisting on being understood. He knows that waiting for validation from someone who has repeatedly dismissed or devalued his emotional experience is a form of slow spiritual erosion. When a man walks away, he is choosing clarity over confusion. He is choosing peace over chaos. He is saying that his inner harmony is more valuable than trying to hold together something built on avoidance or emotional inconsistency. He no longer wants to translate someone's mixed signals. He no longer wants to beg for moments of affection or try to interpret what silence means. Emotional maturity is choosing to stop dancing with uncertainty when that dance begins to bruise the soul. And still, it hurts. Maturity doesn't mean numbness. It means feeling the pain, acknowledging the disappointment, mourning the dreams that won't unfold, and still choosing to walk forward without resentment. It means allowing the silence to speak louder than pleas ever could. The mature man grieves, but he does not regress. He does not return to what keeps him stuck. He learns the lesson, holds the memory, and releases the grip. He also understands that walking away is not always permanent in form. It can be emotional, psychological, energetic. He may still care. He may still wish the best, but he no longer gives his energy to a space where his presence is minimized. He may be near in proximity, but far in investment. He no longer overextends himself to hold someone accountable for showing up. That's not his role. That's their responsibility. His responsibility is to himself, to remain aligned with what he knows is true, with what he knows is healthy. This act of walking away is ultimately about boundaries, not the kind of boundaries that create walls, but those that protect the sacredness of the heart. He knows his worth. He knows what he brings to the table. He knows that love should not be a war zone where one must constantly prove their place. It should be a home, safe, mutual, and emotionally nourishing. And if he finds himself as a stranger in that home, no longer seen, no longer heard, no longer felt, then he will gather his dignity and leave. Not in anger, not in haste, but in reverence for what was, for what wasn't, and for what he will no longer deny himself. There's a profound truth that rarely gets spoken in the language of love. Silence often says what words are too afraid to reveal. In intimate relationships, we tend to equate expression with presence. We speak to be heard, we explain to be understood, we argue to be right. But there are moments when true power, true clarity, and true emotional force reside not in the volume of our voices, but in the stillness of our withdrawal. When a man chooses silence not as a manipulation, not as a punishment, but as a conscious departure from emotional chaos, he is speaking in a language that only the soul can truly hear. In the noise of modern relationships, where every action is often analyzed, defended, or debated, silence is disruptive. It halts the usual dance of emotional games and reactive communication. It interrupts the pattern of conflict and confusion. And that is precisely why it's so powerful. A man who walks away silently is not fleeing the conversation. He is offering a deeper one that is not bound by words, one that invites the other to reflect rather than respond. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the most honest form of it when words have failed to carry their weight. In relationships that lack balance, where one person is always explaining while the other evades, or one is pleading for connection while the other remains indifferent, silence becomes a mirror. When a man withdraws without rage, without guilt, tripping, and without theatrics, he's not creating distance for the sake of control, he's creating space for truth. His absence speaks. It confronts the other with the impact of their own choices. It reveals the emotional labor he was carrying, the presence he offered that had perhaps become invisible through familiarity or neglect. There is a quality in this silence that evokes awareness. It is often only in someone's quiet exit that we begin to feel the gravity of their presence. When he no longer tries to convince, no longer justifies his worth, no longer reminds her of the weight of his care, something begins to shift. Silence creates a void that words could never fill. In that void, the echo of his loyalty, his attention, his emotional depth lingers. And for the first time, perhaps, it is felt not as noise, but as essence. The mature man does not silence himself out of pride or fear. He does so from discernment. He recognizes when words are no longer bridging the gap, but widening it. He sees when speaking further would only lead to more misunderstanding or more self-sacrifice. So he chooses another form of expression, the decision to no longer engage in ways that hurt him. This is not passivity. This is active self-respect. Silence, in his case, is not withdrawal from intimacy. It is protection of it. It is the refusal to dilute what is sacred by forcing it where it's not welcome. We often underestimate the emotional discipline it takes to walk away quietly, to feel the pull to speak, to correct, to make someone see, and to instead take a breath and choose non-reaction. That is the work of a man who knows his inner world. He does not need to convince another of his value. He does not need to be louder to be known. His silence is not emptiness, it is a reservoir of unspoken truths. It is the quiet storm of unmet needs, unreturned efforts, and unseen emotional offerings that finally stopped being poured out onto dry ground. In silence, he allows the space to become its own teacher. If the relationship is to have a future, it must be rebuilt not on desperate explanations, but on awakened awareness. The silence can call the other person into accountability. It can reveal to them, in the absence of his presence, what his presence truly meant, not because he demanded it, but because he withdrew from the demand for it. He lets the silence do what words could not, invite genuine realization rather than resistance. The man who embraces this kind of silence does not see it as the end of connection, but the beginning of something more honest. He trusts that if there is still life in the bond, it will reveal itself without him needing to perform for it. He does not need to beg for clarity or connection. He embodies it, and if that embodiment goes unseen, he does not fight harder. He steps back further, not from coldness but from clarity, not to teach a lesson but to live one. This silence is sacred. It is not weaponized. It does not come with ultimatums. It is a boundary that speaks in subtle ways. I will not chase where I am not met. I will not continue what has become emotionally unsustainable. I will not lose myself trying to keep something alive that no longer breathes with me. This kind of silence breaks patterns. It interrupts cycles. It opens the door to truth, raw, unfiltered, and often painful truth. But within that truth lies the only real possibility for something new, something deeper, something more aligned. There is a subtle erosion that happens when one person becomes the pursuer in a relationship. It begins quietly, often unnoticed, wrapped in the language of effort, care, and persistence. It disguises itself as love, as devotion, as commitment. But over time, the one who is constantly reaching, initiating, fixing, explaining, and waiting slowly begins to disappear. Their needs begin to shrink, their voice begins to dim, and what remains is a pattern of self-abandonment justified in the name of love. The cost of chasing, while invisible at first, accumulates in emotional debt, and often the one paying that debt is unaware of how much they are truly losing. When a man finds himself always chasing, always working to maintain the connection, to keep her attention, to fix the distance, he is unconsciously stepping into a role where his value is contingent on effort rather than essence. He is no longer seen for who he is, but for how well he performs in keeping the relationship alive. This performance, though praised in popular narratives about perseverance and romantic pursuit, is a distortion. It reduces love to a transaction. The more he gives, the more he might be loved. But love that is earned through exhaustion is not love. It is dependency, often one-sided and unsustainable. Chasing can feel thrilling at first. There is a sense of purpose, of clarity, of desire. It can feel like an expression of commitment, of wanting to be chosen. But when that pursuit continues in the face of emotional unavailability, inconsistency, or indifference, it stops being romantic and starts being a form of self-erasure. A man begins to adapt himself around her needs, her moods, her timing. He becomes attuned to her every signal, while his own emotional signals go ignored. He becomes fluent in reading her silence, but loses fluency in expressing his own. This imbalance creates a subtle power dynamic where one person becomes the center and the other becomes the orbit. The man who is always pursuing is constantly adjusting, analyzing, wondering. He begins to measure his worth by her response. Did she reply? Did she seem distant? Did she reciprocate the gesture? His internal world becomes dictated by her level of engagement, and he slowly forgets the stability of his own center. He forgets that he, too, is allowed to be pursued. He, too, deserves emotional reciprocity without having to earn it through relentless effort. The deeper cost lies in what he begins to tolerate, the emotional breadcrumbs he accepts, the late replies, the vague answers, the lukewarm affection. He rationalizes them, makes excuses for them, tells himself to be patient, and in doing so, he chips away at his own emotional standards. He tells himself that this is how love works, that it's messy, that people are complicated. But what he's actually doing is training himself to settle for less while calling it devotion. He is normalizing one-sided emotional labor and calling it commitment. And each time he does, he moves further from his emotional integrity. Chasing also dulls the internal compass. The man who is chasing often stops asking himself if he even feels truly met, seen, or cherished. He becomes so focused on gaining approval that he forgets to ask whether the space he's in is emotionally healthy. He's so busy trying to be enough that he never pauses to ask if the relationship even aligns with his deeper needs. He wants to be chosen so badly that he forgets he too has a choice. To step back, to assess, to walk away if the connection costs him more than it feeds him. There's a quiet grief in this process, a grief that comes from abandoning parts of himself for the sake of keeping someone close. It's the grief of silencing his frustration so he doesn't seem too needy, of accepting mixed signals so he doesn't come off as too demanding, of shrinking his boundaries so the relationship doesn't fall apart. And over time, that grief hardens into resentment, not just toward her, but toward himself. Because deep down, he knows that he's been giving too much and receiving too little, and he's the one allowing it to continue. When a man chooses not to chase, he is not giving up on love. He is reclaiming his right to be loved without overextending. He is remembering that his role is not to constantly pursue, but to participate in a dynamic where both people are emotionally engaged. He is honoring the truth that love does not require him to abandon himself. In stepping away from the chase, he begins the process of emotional repair, returning to the parts of himself he ignored, neglected, or silenced in the pursuit of someone else's attention. It takes strength to see the chase for what it is, a cycle that often keeps him stuck in unworthy dynamics. It takes even more strength to stop running in circles and walk in another direction, not as an act of revenge, not to make a statement, but as a quiet vow to himself, to no longer confuse emotional survival with connection, to no longer label emotional neglect as independence, to no longer participate in relationships where he feels like he must earn his place. He no longer views love as something to catch up to, but something that walks alongside him, matching his pace, meeting him fully, without needing to be pursued endlessly. When a man walks away silently, without protest, without accusation, without a final performance of pain, his absence creates a powerful emotional ripple. It is not the kind of absence that seeks attention, nor is it engineered to provoke guilt. It is an absence born of clarity, a quiet yet profound realization that presence without recognition begins to deteriorate the soul. And in the space left behind by his departure, something rare and confronting happens. The other is finally left alone with the truth of what he represented. There is something deeply human about not recognizing value until it's no longer available. When someone is consistently there, emotionally attuned, offering care without demands, showing up with steadiness, their presence can begin to fade into the background. It becomes part of the scenery, expected, assumed. We don't question the ground beneath our feet until it trembles. We don't always appreciate the warmth of a flame until the room goes cold. The man who walks away silently doesn't leave with resentment. He leaves with the understanding that staying unacknowledged is a betrayal of his own emotional depth. His absence, though, is not a disappearance. It is a message, not one that is shouted or broadcasted, but one that echoes in the spaces where his presence used to be felt. The messages he used to send, the attention he used to give, the emotional labor he carried without being asked. The patience, the listening, the soft strength of showing up even when the other person pulled away. All of those things become visible in reverse. In his silence, the fullness of what he gave becomes impossible to ignore. It is often in the quiet after a man leaves that the other begins to realize how much he held, not just in practical ways, but emotionally. His stability may have grounded the relationship. His steady affection may have softened the edges of conflict. His emotional presence may have filled a space that the other person didn't even know they had grown dependent on. But because he never dramatized his care, because he gave quietly, consistently, without seeking reward, it was easy to overlook. His love was not loud, but it was real. And now, in his absence, it becomes unmistakably clear just how much space he took up in silence. This kind of departure often brings about a moment of reckoning, the realization that his withdrawal is not a game but a truth, that his silence is not passive aggression but a boundary, that his distance is not punishment but preservation. It forces the other person to look at the relationship not through the lens of fantasy or projection, but through the lived experience of what it actually was. And often, that experience reveals a dynamic where he was giving more than he received, where his emotional generosity was being absorbed but not reciprocated. There is no greater mirror than the loss of someone who once gave unconditionally. The absence invites a kind of self-confrontation that presence often protects us from. It forces the one left behind to ask, did I truly see him? Did I truly meet him where he was? Did I offer him the emotional safety that he gave to me? Was I listening when he wasn't speaking, or did I only respond to what was obvious? These questions arise not because he demanded them, but because the space he once filled can no longer be ignored. What he teaches through his departure is not wrapped in bitterness or blame. It's wrapped in integrity. He teaches that love is not meant to be extracted from a person, but shared with them. That emotional availability is not something to be tolerated, but reciprocated. That showing up for someone else should never cost the abandonment of oneself. He doesn't say these things aloud. He doesn't need to. His silence teaches them more powerfully than any explanation ever could. The other person may try to interpret his departure through their own lens, confusion, frustration, disbelief. They may wonder why he didn't fight harder, why he didn't stay to resolve things, why he didn't wait longer. But the truth is, he had already stayed too long in a space that stopped honoring who he was. His walking away was not sudden. It was the final step in a journey of inner reflection. It was the moment when he chose to value his emotional health over someone else's inability to meet him. And yet, despite the quiet strength of his decision, his absence is not vindictive. He doesn't seek to be missed for the sake of ego. He seeks no revenge, no delayed validation. He knows that if he must be missed to be seen, then the connection was never whole to begin with. What he offers instead is the invitation to grow, to feel the absence not as punishment, but as a portal to awareness, to confront the emotional imbalance not as a wound, but as a mirror, to learn, perhaps for the first time, what it means to truly show up not just for others, but for oneself. His absence is not a closure, but a turning point. It leaves behind the question that lingers long after he's gone. What was lost when he left, and why wasn't it protected while he was still there? And in that question lies the possibility for the other to finally become present in ways they never were when he was silently carrying the weight of love on his own. In the quiet departure of a man who refuses to chase, there is a profound and often uncomfortable truth about love, worth, and emotional maturity. His silence is not an act of cruelty or indifference. It is a declaration of inner alignment. He no longer participates in dynamics where he is asked to earn affection, prove his value, or beg for reciprocity. Instead, he steps into a deeper integrity, one where he chooses to honor his emotional boundaries over performing for connection. This kind of man does not disappear in anger. He leaves in peace, and in that departure, he teaches more than words ever could. He teaches the value of presence. He reveals the cost of emotional neglect. He makes visible all the ways in which his efforts went unseen. And in the space he leaves behind, he creates room for the other to finally witness the depth of what was once quietly offered and consistently dismissed. Real men do not chase because they understand that love, in its truest form, is mutual. It is not sustained by pursuit, but by reciprocity. They walk away not to prove a point, but to preserve their wholeness. They do not demand to be chosen. They choose themselves when no one else will. And in doing so, they transform not only their own lives, but the emotional landscape of those they leave behind. Through their silent exits, they plant seeds of reflection, awareness, and sometimes a late awakening to what real love actually requires: presence, respect, effort, and emotional truth from both sides.